They said her roof would collapse before Christmas. They whispered she was too pregnant to hammer a board straight. But they were wrong about her. Dead wrong. And by the time they saw what she built, they'd already come begging for help. The first time the townsfolk saw her walking up Main Street alone again, they expected her to ask for mercy, not nails. She didn't wear black like the other widows. She wore dirt, caked on her sleeves, dry in her hair, stuck behind her ears, and her belly showed through the buckled buttons of her coat. They watched her walk from the general store to the mill to the smithy, each place with her hands out. But she wasn't asking for coin. She was asking for rock, for mud, for stone. Not a soul understood why, and no one offered help, because she was supposed to leave after he died. That's what always happened. When a man died out here, the woman packed, sold the mule if it still breathed, took the children, or the memory of them, and fled to a cousin back east, or to a preacher in the city, or straight to the grave if winter came too soon. But this one didn't. This one didn't even cry loud enough at the funeral. She just stood there with one hand on her stomach, the other on the coffin lid, as if pressing something into it. She didn't lower her head, didn't beg for comfort, didn't break. And then she walked away, before the men even filled the hole. Walked back up the long hill to the half-finished cabin and the plot of earth he'd tried to clear before his lungs gave out. Everyone assumed she'd fall apart by the first frost. Most hoped she would, not cruelly, just naturally. Like a tree that can't keep standing after the storm that shaped it disappears. Like the wife dies after the man, even if her heart keeps beating. But she didn't fall, not when the winds came early, not when the neighbors stopped dropping off stew, not when the preacher stopped coming around just to check in, and not when the miller's boy spat at her boots and called her belly a useless burden on the town. She only flinched once, that first night alone, when the fire went out before midnight and the boards creaked above her. She hadn't known until then that she was more afraid of the roof falling than of the wolves howling. It was that fear, the roof caving in over her, and the baby, that did it, that made her rise in the pitch dark, dig through the frozen mud behind the cabin with her bare hands, and smear the first handful of earth onto the cold log wall. By morning her fingernails were gone. By the next day, half the front wall looked like some ugly red clay beast was growing out of it, patching the gaps between logs with frozen pulp. The townspeople started calling it names. The womb with a tomb, the mud castle, the stillborn shack, and once, her husband's grave has stronger walls. No one thought she'd keep at it, but she did, each day with snow crunching. Underfoot and her belly heavier, she hauled stones from the frozen creek bed, smashing them with a rusted pick to wedge them into the seams of the logs. She mixed mud with what straw she had. She stomped it, packed it, pressed it into every crack. She slept only when the fire, one single log each night, burned low enough not to crackle. She didn't dare use more. The stack of logs he'd left was down to 3 by then. Just 3. When the first real snowstorm came, she didn't cower. She stood outside with a shawl over her head, watching how the wind curved around the new thickened wall. She didn't smile, but her shoulders relaxed. She could feel it. The way the cold clawed at the cabin had changed. It no longer seeped in like before. It struck and stayed out. She kept building. Then came the collapse at the sheriff's own porch. It was a week later. That same wind peeled the shingles off his roof like they were wet paper. One beam snapped clean through. His wife had screamed. His youngest broke a rib. And when the sheriff stomped into town cussing about faulty wood and that cursed cold, he stopped short outside the general store and stared at the hill. A chimney was smoking. She hadn't come down for help. She hadn't come down at all. That was when the rumors began to turn. First it was muttered in awe, then in panic. "She's still alive up there? She hasn't bought firewood in weeks?" That place should have buckled in the last freeze. And then came the third snow, the one that sealed all the lesser cabins shut, the one that howled through every seam in town like a screaming woman, the one that cracked window panes and burst pipes in the newer homes and left a few old men frozen stiff by morning. But her cabin still smoked, one log, nightly, nothing more. That's when they started knocking. First it was the boy who'd spit at her. His mother sent him up with a pail of milk, his ears red from both frost and shame. She didn't open the door for him, but she took the milk. Next came the preacher. He said it was just to check on her, but he kept glancing up at the roof, down at the walls, at the chimney's thick, warm breath. She didn't open for him either, but she let him leave a bag of flour on the step. Then came the sheriff, and that's when it happened. He didn't knock. He shouted from 20 feet away. Voice loud, proud, maybe half apologizing for the past. Said he didn't want charity. Said he just wanted to know how you did it. Said there were other families worse off than her now. Said they were sick, cold, scared, that roofs were cracking, babies were coughing, wives were crying, and he needed help. Her door opened just enough for him to see her face. It was red from heat, sweat on her brow, cheeks full, breathing heavy. She said just 4 words. "Send the women up." Then she shut it again. They came by the dozen that first day. Women wrapped in shawls, dragging their skirts through snow, some with babies, some without. Most had husbands and left them behind. None of them had ever asked a widow for advice before. None had expected to, but now they listened, and she taught, not with a chalkboard or long words. She taught with her hands. She showed them how to find the right mud, how to mix it to stick, how to shape it tight into the gaps. She taught them how to stuff wool into corners, how to wedge stone where no timber could survive, how to use wet moss to seal a frame. She even showed them how to build a chimney that drew heat like a lung, and how to survive off one single log. By the time they returned to their homes, they were changed. They knew the weight of mud in a pail, they knew the sting of cold on bare stone, and they knew it was possible. Possible because a pregnant widow hadn't flinched. But the men didn't like it. They said it made them look weak. They said it wasn't natural for women to lay stone. They said she was turning wives into widows in waiting. They said a lot of things that winter, but not one of them said it to her face, because while they talked, she kept building, and inside that mud-sealed cabin, beneath the stone-packed walls, and behind the single crackling log, she felt the baby kick stronger than ever, strong enough to tell her she hadn't just built a shelter, she'd built a future. The strange thing was, the more they mocked her, the warmer her cabin got. By January's second week, the entire town had started to talk like they lived under her shadow. Every conversation at the post office or in the dim back room of the saloon curved eventually back to her name, though none dared say it with any reverence. They still called her the widow, sometimes the pregnant brickmaker, occasionally worse. But there was a hush that followed those jokes now, a silence like the one before thunder, where everyone feels something big's about to break, even if they don't admit it. She didn't leave the hill much anymore, not unless she had to. The ice on the slope was slick, and her stomach was nearly full term. But the days she did come down, wrapped in a second-hand coat with a basket on her hip, always walking like she was balancing something more sacred than she could say. The streets parted without anyone asking. Children stopped playing. Grown men looked at their boots. A few old women nodded, but no one tried to stop her or offer a hand anymore, because everyone had started to suspect the same thing. She was surviving better than any of them. The frost didn't bite her cheeks as deep. Her eyes weren't bloodshot from smoky hearths. Her fingers didn't tremble. When the blacksmith's wife caught sight of her once inside the apothecary, she swore the widow's cheeks were flushed with color. She said it didn't look like cold, it looked like heat, as if somehow she'd made her cabin not just livable, but warm. That same night, the blacksmith tried sealing his own cabin's cracks with leftover mud from the horse trough, but it froze stiff and flaked off within hours. He cursed, blamed her for spreading false hope, but deep down, even he knew the problem wasn't the mud. The problem was that she knew something they didn't, and she wasn't telling, not to the men anyway. She only told the women. They came again, quiet and desperate, 3 days after a pipe burst in the schoolhouse, and the children spent 2 days coughing in the chapel basement. This time there were more of them. The sheriff's wife, 2 mill wives, the storekeeper's daughter, and even the old widow who hadn't spoken since 1872. They knocked in the wind, stood on her step while the snow slapped their faces, and didn't leave when the door stayed closed. They stood in silence until the door cracked open. She didn't ask them what they wanted. She just stepped aside and let them in. The warmth inside felt unnatural, like something stolen from another land entirely. No draft kissed their ankles, no smoke stung their eyes. The walls looked like they belonged in the earth itself, solid, layered with pulped clay and careful stone, tight as castle masonry. The chimney wasn't wide, but exhaled slow and low like it was breathing, not burning. The pregnant widow didn't say much. She gestured, nodded, showed them the pail in the corner, the straw pile beside it, the paddle she'd carved from a broken yoke to spread the mud like butter. She peeled back a section of wall she'd left half-finished and let them see the layers: log, straw, moss, then packed mud, then stone wedges, then more mud. She touched the seam at the base where the wall met the floor, and they gasped when they felt no cold at all. She gave them no speech, only instruction, only example, and they watched her work even with her belly heavy, her breaths slow. She didn't groan, didn't complain, didn't tremble. The sheriff's wife wept when she stepped back into the cold again, said she'd forgotten what warmth even felt like. By the following morning, 5 more cabins had mud-patched seams. The storekeeper's roof was layered with snow-thick clay, straw mixed in like bread dough, dried over with hot coals in a pan she dragged from corner to corner. It smoked, but it held. Men began to notice. They didn't like what they saw. It wasn't just jealousy. though there was plenty of that. It was the fact that something had changed, something they couldn't control. Their wives were working in silence, not asking for nails or help, just showing up at the creek to chip stones loose, boiling straw, mixing ash with water, and whispering things to each other in voices too low to catch. A few men confronted them. One tried to forbid his wife from going back to the hill. She didn't argue. She just stared at him with a look so blank and cold that he stepped aside without knowing why. Some of them said she was doing witchcraft, that she'd cast a spell over the women, that the mud was cursed. But those same men started asking questions the very next week when the frost cracked their beams and dropped a whole roof onto the dining table during supper. No one died, but the fire went out, and no one came to help, except the widow. She didn't knock, she didn't ask. She just showed up with two other women, one dragging a bucket of clay, and the other carrying a rope of moss tied around her waist. They didn't speak, they just worked, repacking the beam, reinforcing the corner with a lattice of twigs, threading wool into the new gap like a quilt seam. One man tried to offer coin. She didn't even blink, just turned away and left before the kettle boiled. They stopped calling it a curse after that. Some started calling it her method. Some whispered it was better than a mason's wall. The preacher called it ungodly clever. The storekeeper called it unnaturally effective. The miller called it humbling. By February, more than 20 homes had adopted parts of her build. Some couldn't do it all. They lacked the right soil, or the right hands, or the patience. But even a half attempt helped. The temperature in the cabins rose by degrees that felt like miracles. Babies stopped coughing, cows stopped freezing, and every morning the people looked up the hill toward the cabin that started it all, the one that never stopped smoking, and wondered how a woman so close to birthing could still teach them all how to live. But not everyone accepted it. A man named Boyle, burly, red-cheeked, always loud, had a grudge that went deeper than cold. He'd lost his wife the year before, claimed no one grieved harder, claimed no one worked harder either, said the widow made a mockery of grief, that she clung to the world like some tick, that she disrespected her husband's memory by pretending she didn't need him, that a proper woman ought to mourn with silence, not mud. He drank more that winter, stumbled around the saloon with words like witch and fake, said he'd prove she wasn't better than the rest of them, that she'd cracked like anyone else, just hid it better. Then he marched up the hill. She didn't answer when he pounded on the door. He shouted, demanded she come out, said he wanted to see the miracle for himself. She didn't answer. So he walked around the house, kicked at the walls, slapped the chimney, threw a stone at the eaves. The door opened. She stepped out, breathing hard, hand on her stomach. He stared, suddenly unsure. She didn't look afraid, just tired. Her hair stuck to her face, her feet bare on the snow-packed stoop, her lips cracked but firm. "I ain't afraid of you," he spat. She didn't answer. He took a step closer, said she owed him an explanation, said no woman survives like this without help, said she must be hiding someone inside, a man, a beast, a devil, something. The look she gave him shut him up. She said just one thing. "I did what he asked." Then she went back inside and locked the door. No one knew what she meant, not then, but it haunted Boyle, haunted him so badly that he didn't sleep that night, or the one after. He came down with fever, cold sweat clinging to his shirt, muttering that she knew something about death that he didn't. He wouldn't stop saying her name, not until the 5th night, when he stumbled out into the street barefoot and vanished into the woods. They found his body by the creek come spring. No one blamed her. No one even mentioned him again, because that week, her pains began. The women gathered. They brought cloth, water, wood. They brought hands that had laid stone and mixed mud, hands that had been taught not to tremble. They came quietly, without men, without gossip, without fear, and they surrounded her. The child came slow, long, painful, but it came warm, born in the same room where no frost had touched her, born under walls she built with nothing but grief and earth, born while a single log burned, just like every night before. The baby was a girl. She did not cry at first. Then, after a moment, one long enough to stretch into panic, she did, strong and clear. And when her cry rang out through that chimney, the townsfolk below stopped what they were doing. Some crossed themselves. Some wiped their eyes. Some simply looked at the snow and said nothing. But every one of them, deep in their chests, felt something shift. Because that night, the coldest of the year, no one's firewood lasted long, except hers. And while the snow piled high, and the wind scraped at their windows, they saw the same thin thread of chimney smoke curl from her roof into the black sky like a prayer or a promise. The morning after the child was born, something had changed in the air, though no one could say exactly what. The snow was the same as the day before, thick, crusted, hard as granite on the road down from the hill, but it didn't seem to bite as much. The wind still howled against shutters and curled down chimneys, but somehow it sounded further away, as though it had given up breaking through and wandered off to torment some other unlucky town. There wasn't a single knock at her door that day. The women stayed inside their own cabins now, mimicking her work in earnest, each stitching moss and packing clay into their walls with quiet, reverent effort. No one wanted to disturb the quiet up the hill, because they all knew what had happened. A child had been born in the warmest cabin in town, and not a soul had helped build it but her. The preacher was the first to come up that day, not to offer words or prayer, but simply to see. He didn't knock, didn't dare. He stood at the edge of the yard, hands folded at his stomach, eyes raised like he was staring up at a church steeple instead of a woman's hand-packed roof. The smoke curled up steady, and he just nodded to himself, lips moving without a sound. Then he turned and walked back down the hill, slipping once on the ice and not even cursing when he fell. The sheriff came next. He brought blankets and a jar of preserved peaches. Not for charity, he insisted, to no one, but because it was only neighborly. When he knocked and the door didn't open, he left them neatly by the stoop. He lingered a while, staring at the seams in the wall, at the way the corner where the logs met the stone was now coated in a final layer of what looked like ash-soaked clay, hardened to a dark grey hue. The edges had been smoothed, not like plaster, but something firmer, something permanent. He whispered, "She sealed it like a tomb," but he didn't mean it cruelly, because that cabin hadn't become a tomb. It had become something else entirely. Word spread fast. The baby was healthy. The mother was well. She'd done it. Survived winter, pregnancy, death, ridicule, solitude, and now she'd brought forth life into the coldest season in living memory. Women whispered her name now with a strange mixture of reverence and fear. Children asked their mothers if she'd ever been anything but pregnant and strong. And men, especially the older ones who'd spent decades believing they knew what women were capable of, spoke little and watched their wives work with a new kind of silence. But it wasn't over, because February still had weeks left in it, and the worst storm was yet to come. They didn't see it coming, not this time. The wind had changed so many times that winter already, no one trusted the sky anymore. But when the first black wall of clouds rolled over the ridge and swallowed the light by noon, even the animals began to act strange. Chickens huddled in corners, horses refused to drink, dogs whined and buried themselves in hay. Then came the cold, not just bitter or sharp, but so deep it made metal groan and glass whisper. Then the snow, not flakes, not drifts. It came like a wall, sideways, furious, screaming across the land like it meant to scour the very memory of warmth from the valley. The town was not ready. Cabins buckled, windows shattered, roofs lifted and snapped like tinder. Fires sputtered and died under the weight of wet snow that poured down chimneys and soaked hearths. Mothers held babies to their breasts, crying, cursing, praying. Men screamed at the wind, at their stoves, at God. And then someone saw it. Through the chaos, through the horizontal haze of white and death, someone glimpsed it. A faint glow at the top of the hill. Just a curl of chimney smoke, still rising, unbothered. Her cabin, still standing, still burning, still alive. The first man who made the climb nearly died on the slope. His boots slid out twice. His lantern blew out. He crawled the last 50 feet on hands and knees, frostbitten and blinded. When he reached her door, he didn't knock. He collapsed. She opened it anyway. She pulled him in, fed him warmth, wrapped his hands in cloth dipped in the same clay she'd used on her walls, not to cure frostbite, but to slow the pain. He wept when he could feel his fingers again. She didn't ask him to leave. She didn't speak much at all, just stoked the fire and sealed the door tight again. That's when they started coming in pairs. Husbands carrying wives, mothers carrying infants, one boy dragging his brother on a sled made from the broken back of a door. They came from every corner of the town, crawling up through the ice like ghosts fleeing judgment, and she let them in, every single one. The cabin was small, built for two. Now there were more than 20 inside. They didn't ask how it was possible. They didn't wonder why the walls didn't sweat or shudder or groan under the weight. They just breathed and felt heat and wept in quiet disbelief. The baby, hers, didn't cry through the storm, slept through it, cheek pressed to her mother's chest, small fingers curled around a lock of hair. The women took turns holding her when the widow needed to stir the fire or move a pot. They sang softly, old songs their mothers used to sing when life was simpler. Men sat in silence, listening. Some said nothing, some apologized, some just held their heads in their hands and cried for everything they hadn't done. When the storm broke, it left destruction so total it looked like war. Half the cabins in the valley were collapsed. Trees had split like matchsticks. The chapel's roof had caved. Even the schoolhouse, sturdy and old, had suffered a partial collapse. Livestock wandered, lost or frozen. Fences were gone, sheds buried. But her cabin stood, not a log loose, not a seam cracked, not a single sign of weakness. The sheriff declared it a miracle. The preacher called it a providential testament to perseverance. The women called it what it was: work, stone, mud, wool, sweat, and will. And now that it had saved lives, no one laughed at her method again. They asked to learn. And this time she didn't just nod or gesture. She taught, fully, openly. She gathered the women and the older children, and even the men who came with hands ready, not mouths. She drew diagrams in the dirt. She demonstrated the blend, not too wet, not too dry. She let them feel the cured seams, the way the wool was pinched between log and clay, the way the stones were chosen to wedge against each other with no space between. Then she walked the valley with them, one cabin at a time, pointed where beams had failed, showed where drafts snuck in, explained how the fire could draw better with a reshaped chimney throat. She didn't speak often, but when she did, they listened, because by then, no one could deny it. She had done what none of them could: survived. Not in silence, not in grief, not in waiting for rescue, but by building, one handful of earth at a time. She never asked for recognition, never stood in the town square to be thanked, but they did it anyway. On the first warm day of March, after the snow began to melt and the earth softened, they gathered at her door, men, women, children. They came with gifts, sacks of flour, bolts of fabric, a set of hand-carved toys, a new pot for the hearth. Someone brought her husband's old coat, mended and cleaned. Another brought a chair, sturdy and low for nursing. The preacher offered a blessing. The sheriff gave her the town's last store of bricks, unused, weathered, but still strong. She didn't weep. She only bowed her head once. And then, quietly, she stepped back inside, the baby asleep in her arms. They didn't follow. They didn't need to, because everyone had learned what they came for. The town would rebuild now. Not with timber alone, but with the strength she showed them. Not with pity, but with stone, with earth, with the same stubborn clay she'd packed by hand when she was most alone. And behind her walls, a single log burned steady. Still enough, still warm, still hers. By early spring, she no longer had to speak. Her walls had done all the talking, and everyone listened. They came down from the mountains that month. Other settlers, scattered families from homesteads miles off. They'd seen the smoke rising from her chimney through the blizzards, a strange, steady pillar against the endless sky. They'd heard rumors in the passes, stories about a widow who had built a cabin from earth and grief and nothing else, who had given birth during the freeze and housed half a town through a storm that should have killed them all. They didn't believe it, not until they saw the town, not until they saw what remained. Of the 27 original cabins that made up the edge of the valley, only 6 stood untouched. 2 had roofs patched in a style that now everyone recognized, thick-lipped, with gray-baked mud, seams packed with moss and rope, cornerstones pressed in like a mason's teeth. The others were being rebuilt, and all followed the same method, her method. The widow's cabin stood at the crest like a citadel, not larger, not grander, but tougher, more resolved in posture. The mud now cured to a deep ruddy brown, smooth and wind-burnished, like leather stretched over the bones of something ancient. A second chimney had been added at some point, though no one had seen her do it. A low lean-to jutted from the back now, covered with layered stone tiles, so precisely laid they looked like fish scales. No one knew what she used to cut them. They only knew she had done it alone. The travelers asked for her. They said they had babies too, that their roofs were gone, that the old man up the ridge had frozen mid-step, that the snow had come down like a curse and stayed too long, that some of them had started to believe the land itself was turning against them until they saw her walls. They asked if she would teach them. She said yes, and the valley changed. Where once the widow had been mocked, now she was mimicked. She didn't become a leader in the usual sense. She didn't bark orders or take over the town hall. She didn't ask for votes or respect. She never even raised her voice. But when decisions needed to be made about materials or shelter or warmth, it was her door they went to, her method they followed, and her face they looked to when doubts started rising. She never smiled at the recognition, but she didn't refuse it either. She simply kept building. She taught them how to read the earth, to know the difference between mud that dried into weakness and mud that dried into strength. She showed them how to mix in ash or horsehair or gravel, how to judge a wall by the sound it made when you knocked, how to cut logs to wedge without nails, how to shape clay to cradle fire instead of flee from it. She taught by doing, not by speech. And still, she only used 1 log a night. They asked her how. She didn't tell them, not directly, but the clues were always there. In the way she shaped her chimney so it drew low and slow, in the way she layered her floor with straw packed under flat stones, in the way she stacked her fire pit inside a U-shaped wall of hardened clay that seemed to trap the warmth and reflect it inward. Her cabin didn't just hold fire, it folded it inward, kept it breathing longer, like a heart. Still, not everyone was satisfied. A few of the older men had started to feel displaced. They didn't say it aloud at first, but it festered in corners of the saloon, under their breath, when they saw their wives taking instruction from her. They didn't like seeing their boys learn how to patch walls from a woman. Didn't like that folks were calling her ma'am with the kind of tone they used for the mayor. Then came Larrabee. He was the kind of man who always spoke like he was owed something. Tall, with a heavy brow and fists that looked like they'd never known rest. He tried to take over the rebuilding effort in town, declared himself reconstruction foreman without being asked, claimed he knew better ways to weatherproof than some pregnant mud hauler, said it loud enough in the middle of the general store that everyone turned. The room went quiet. Someone said gently, "She already had the baby." He rolled his eyes and muttered something uglier. The widow wasn't there, but the words reached her, and she didn't argue. She simply waited, because she knew the storm wasn't over, knew that spring snow could fall heavier than winter's rage, knew that a single freeze could still crack half a town apart. And then, 2 weeks later it came. Not a blizzard this time, but a cold rain that swept down from the northern ridgeline with a vengeance. A rain that soaked the ground so deep that foundations shifted, beams warped, and unsealed homes steamed like kettles as their hearths drowned. Larrabee's cabin was the first to flood. He had built it, fast, eager to show how little he needed her ways, had used old planks, loose nails, tar only half cured. His seams opened like mouths. His roof sagged, then cracked. His stove hissed, then died. He stormed through the mud cursing, dragging a mattress out the front door, soaked through, swearing he'd been sabotaged. No one believed him. The widow said nothing, but when the others came up to her cabin to check on her, not to ask for help but just to be sure, they found her dry, warm, unbothered. She had layered her walls with a final coat that no one had seen before, a top finish of stone dust and clay that had dried to a finish hard as concrete. It repelled water. It turned rain to runnels that slid harmlessly off and away from the seams. They stood in silence, staring, and slowly the men began to shift, not in attitude, but in posture. They started to follow, started to mimic her walls more precisely, started to dig deeper, layer thicker, listen closer. They didn't always say thank you, but they copied her nonetheless. And the town changed again. By late spring, no one laughed at mud anymore. No one scoffed at stone. And no one questioned the widow when she walked into town with her daughter strapped across her chest. The child had grown strong, dark hair, bright eyes, and already the same quiet look as her mother, like she saw more than she let on. They said the baby never cried, that she only stared, wide-eyed, as if memorizing the world that tried to kill her before she was born. They said she would build greater things someday, and they believed it, because the town was alive, and not just alive, but better. They had warmth now, not just heat. Their homes didn't shake, their children didn't cough, their fires didn't need endless wood. They had learned something deeper than construction or technique. They had learned what survival looked like when it was quiet, patient, deliberate. They had learned that it didn't come from shouting, it came from hands in the earth, from grief turned into action, from walls packed with purpose, from a woman no one thought would last the winter, who had outlasted them all and still burned a single log. By summer, the earth she once scraped with bare hands began to bloom. Grass grew thick along the path where her boots had trudged all winter. Flowers sprouted in crooked lines along the cracks of stone she'd laid without ceremony. The old snowdrifts had vanished, leaving only flattened straw and footprints hardened into memory. And still, the cabin stood, unchanged, unshaken, unbothered by the seasons that once threatened to bury her. Its walls held firm, the chimney smoke long gone now, but its legend lingering in every sunrise. They built a new structure beside the chapel that spring, not for prayer, not for meetings, not for law. It was built low, wide, with walls of stone, mud, and packed earth. Her design. Inside it they kept examples, bricks made from her. Method, diagrams etched in charcoal on thick hide, even the very paddle she'd carved to lay her seams. They called it the Hearth Hall, not a monument, just a place to remember what warmth really meant. No one voted her into anything. No title was ever given. But when settlers arrived in town, when wayfarers passed through, it was her name they heard before any other. It was her door they were pointed toward when they asked how to survive. She never charged them coin, only asked they listen, that they watch, that they learn. One evening, not long after the last frost, the widow stood at the edge of her porch with her daughter in her arms, now big enough to grip her collar and lean toward the wind. The town below was quiet, fires lit, children laughing in the distance, the smell of stew drifting from a dozen chimneys. The sheriff passed on his horse, tipping his hat. The preacher nodded as he walked by with a satchel of kindling. No words were exchanged. They weren't needed, because everyone knew she had outlived the winter, outlived pity, outlived mockery, and she had given them something no man, no preacher, no book ever had, a way to survive, with dignity, with bare hands, with mud and stone, and a single log still resting in the hearth behind her. Still enough, still waiting, still hers.